Welcome to the Ghastly Journal. Tonight, we open not with a single family or isolated tragedy, but with the scattered traces of something far older and far more disturbing. Hidden among forgotten county ledgers, sealed court documents, and fading newspaper clippings lies a thread that, when followed, unravels into a story America itself has tried to bury. It is not a tale of a single murderer or frontier desperation, but of ritual, deliberate, practiced, and sustained through generations. The subject is cannibalism, not as the result of starvation or madness, but as a creed, a cult, woven into the bloodlines of families who once walked among us. In dusty archive basements across the country, beneath the fluorescent hum of government offices, files sit misfiled or deliberately misnamed. A coroner's report from Missouri, 1891, describing bite marks on human remains written off in the official summary as wild animal predation. A sheriff's ledger from Iowa listing child disappearances, suspected abductions, pages later glued together so that the names are lost. A federal memorandum dated 1946, its lines blacked into silence, mentioning only two words: ritual anthropophagy. The story begins in fragments. A doctor's handwritten note slipped between census records. A witness statement hastily recorded before the man was declared insane. A farmer's diary that survived a barn fire, its edges charred, yet still legible, where he describes the feast. Individually, each seems an anomaly. Together, they form a pattern, one that suggests something more than coincidence. There were families in rural America, tucked into valleys, hidden along mountain ridges, who practiced rites not seen since the darkest pages of Old World folklore. They married only among themselves, inherited farms that outsiders were warned away from, and maintained a silence enforced not just by secrecy but by fear. Generations later, their names appear only in fragments: Atwater, Hollowell, Dunst, Shaw, never carrying beyond a century before vanishing from the record entirely, as if whole bloodlines were swallowed by the earth. What did these families believe? That consuming the flesh of kin granted strength? That blood carried memories? The few testimonies that survived suppression speak of ceremonies held on solstices, of children raised not as victims but as initiates, of hymns sung around tables where no animal meat was ever served. A trembling witness in 1927 whispered under oath, "It was not starvation, it was worship." His words were stricken from the official transcript. And so we begin with whispers, nothing concrete enough to satisfy science, yet too consistent to dismiss as folklore. These are not tales of isolated madness, but echoes of an unacknowledged network of cults that thrived in silence. To open the files is to confront the possibility that beneath America's promise of progress and piety ran another current, entirely one of hunger, of ritual, of bloodlines devoted to feeding on their own. This is not a story of history comfortably resolved. It is a story America never wanted to acknowledge. Tonight, we will follow the fragments. And together, we will learn what those who lived in shadow were so desperate to keep from the light. The ghastly journal turns now to a discovery that should have remained buried, yet surfaced in the unlikeliest of places: a church basement in rural Ohio. In the spring of 1974, workers clearing the crumbling foundation of a long-abandoned chapel near Marietta unearthed a wooden chest sealed with iron nails. Inside lay a collection of leather-bound journals, each worn by damp and time, yet miraculously legible. They belonged to Reverend Josiah Shaw, a frontier preacher whose ministry spanned the early decades of the 19th century. What they contained was not scripture, nor sermons of salvation, but a record of horror, an account of families who, according to Shaw, fed on their own dead, and from this practice drew unholy strength. The earliest entry is dated December 1823. Shaw, newly installed as pastor to a scattered congregation along the Ohio River, wrote of his shock upon visiting homesteads in the surrounding hills during the brutal winter. He described the gnawing hunger of the settlers, the snowbound cabins where livestock had perished and crops failed. Yet amid that desperation, he observed something different, something deliberate. In one cabin, he noted, the hearth was warm and the family well fed despite the barren landscape outside. Their cheeks were ruddy, their movements lively, even as their neighbors starved. Shaw at first suspected secret hunting or hidden stores, until he observed bones in the ashes of their fire bones unmistakably human. At first, he told himself it was desperation, that a dead relative had been consumed to stave off hunger. But as weeks passed, Shaw recorded patterns that chilled him. Families who partook of this practice seemed to thrive unnaturally while others withered. Children who ate of their elders appeared to grow in vigor, while the dead were spoken of with unsettling calm, as if their passing had been expected, even planned. They did not weep, Shaw wrote in a trembling hand. They smiled, as though death were a harvest to be gathered and consumed. What turned survival into ritual became clear in subsequent entries. Shaw wrote of gatherings on nights when the wind howled hardest, when families convened in a single cabin, prayers sung not to God but to the hunger. A prayer he transcribed, fragmented and half erased, invoked blessings not of heaven but of flesh. By spring, when food returned, the practice did not cease. Instead, Shaw noted it continued in secret, handed from parent to child, becoming not necessity but tradition. The journals end abruptly in 1827. The final page bears a scrawl so frantic it slants into the margins. It is no longer want that drives them. It is devotion. They will not stop, even in times of plenty. They feast because they believe it binds them. I fear I have lingered too long among them. If these words are found, know that they feed not only on the body but on the soul of America itself. The chest was resealed and sent to a regional archive, where it remained unexamined for nearly half a century. Few who have read Shaw's journals today doubt his sincerity. The question is not whether he believed what he saw, it is whether we dare believe him. Hollow Creek was the kind of place maps barely bothered to name. Nestled in the wooded hills of eastern Kentucky, it was a settlement of barely a few dozen families, a scattering of cabins and farm plots strung along the narrow creek that gave the village its name. For most of the 19th century, it appeared in county records only as a footnote: births, baptisms, the occasional marriage license. But, between 1871 and 1884, Hollow Creek gained another kind of record: disappearance. 27 residents, men, women, and children, vanished without trace. No bodies were ever recovered. No fugitives were ever found. What remains are whispers and fragments, all of them pointing to one family, the Morrises. The Morris clan had lived on the edge of Hollow Creek since the 1830s, occupying a weather-beaten farmhouse that stood at the end of a rutted path winding into the hills. They were, by most accounts, a strange lot, quiet, insular, and fiercely bound to one another. Children were rarely seen in the schoolhouse, though neighbors swore the family had more mouths than anyone could count. Their livestock never seemed to thrive, yet the Morrises themselves appeared hardy, their faces ruddy and their frames strong even in lean years. They were known to accept little from the community and to offer less in return. When the disappearances began, suspicion fell quickly on outsiders, drifters passing through the region. A peddler vanished first, last seen traveling toward Hollow Creek with a cart of wares. Then a pair of brothers failed to return from a hunting trip. Months later, a mother and her 2 children disappeared walking home from church. Each case was logged in the sheriff's ledger, but in the absence of evidence, no charges were brought. Hollow Creek, isolated and poor, was not the kind of place where investigators lingered. It was only in 1885, after the Morris farmhouse caught fire and burned to the ground, that grim confirmation surfaced. When neighbors dug through the smoldering ruins, they uncovered a cellar entrance previously unknown. Inside, Amid the blackened rubble, they found bones. Not the bones of animals, but human remains, hundreds of fragments scattered in heaps. Skulls split cleanly, long bones marked with cuts, as if stripped for marrow. The sheriff at the time, Henry Talbot, noted in his report that the bones appeared to have been harvested. His words were later struck from the official record, replaced with the phrase accidental damage by fire. The Morrises themselves were gone. Some claimed the family perished in the blaze, though no bodies were ever recovered from the ruins. Others insisted they escaped into the hills, vanishing into the endless folds of Kentucky wilderness. Among the villagers, the belief grew that the fire had been no accident at all, but a torch set to cover generations of ritual slaughter. The Morris name disappeared from county records after 1884, but the legend of Hollow Creek endured. Locals swore that in certain winters, when snow buried the roads and the forest stood silent, fires could still be seen flickering deep in the woods. Fires not meant for warmth, but for feasting. New Salem, Illinois, is remembered in schoolbooks as the village where Abraham Lincoln once clerked and studied law, a modest frontier community along the Sangamon River. But buried beneath the polished histories is another story, one that surfaced briefly in 1847 and was then smothered just as quickly. It comes to us not from court transcripts or preserved testimony, those are conspicuously absent, but from the brittle pages of police ledgers rediscovered in a courthouse attic more than a century later. Their entries are terse, the handwriting hurried, but the words are unmistakable. Feast of flesh, broken by deputies. The ledgers describe a raid carried out by 3 county officers responding to reports of strange gatherings on the outskirts of New Salem. Farmers had complained of livestock vanishing, of smoke and chanting rising from a derelict barn after midnight. On the night of March 12th, deputies forced their way into the structure and stumbled into a scene so grotesque that even the fragmentary notes evoke revulsion. A long table, lit by lanterns swinging from rafters. Plates not of bread or stew, but of roasted meat stripped from bones that, when collected later, proved to be human. Witnesses named a half-dozen men and women, all residents of the area, seated in solemn reverence around the table, eating not in desperation but in ritual. The deputies made arrests. Names were entered in the ledger. Carver, Holt, and Jennings among them. Families otherwise known in the community as ordinary farmers and shopkeepers. But beyond those entries, the record falls silent. No trial transcripts exist in county archives. No newspaper accounts from the period reference the incident. It is as if the arrests were made, the evidence collected, and then the entire affair dissolved into smoke. Who intervened? That remains the central question. Some historians suspect local officials feared scandal, unwilling to see New Salem remembered not for its connection to Lincoln, but for cannibal rites in a barn. Others point to the influence of the accused families whose connections reached into neighboring towns. Still others whisper of something more deliberate, a cover-up enforced not merely to protect reputations but to shield knowledge of practices older than the village itself. What little remains is telling. The ledger's final note reads, "All evidence sealed by order of Judge W." The rest of the name has been scratched out with ink, as though someone deliberately obscured the hand responsible. A century later, when the ledgers were found, archivists also uncovered a bundle of charred papers, likely the missing transcripts burned beyond legibility. And yet, rumors persisted in New Salem for generations. Children dared each other to walk past the ruins of the barn where the raid occurred. Farmers spoke of strange fires on the edge of fields during Lent, and of voices carried on the wind. Official history presents New Salem as a symbol of frontier virtue, but beneath the surface lies a record that suggests otherwise, a feast, a ritual, and an erasure so complete it raises the chilling possibility that what was broken that night was never truly ended. The New Jersey Pine Barrens are a place already steeped in myth, a landscape of endless trees and shifting sands where stories of the Jersey Devil and phantom lights have been whispered for centuries. Yet beneath the folklore lies something more tangible and far darker, preserved in the brittle testimony of men who stumbled upon ceremonies they were never meant to see. The earliest comes from 1851, written in a letter by a surveyor named Daniel Marsh, who had been hired to map parcels of land for logging. Lost in the dense barrens after dusk, he described hearing voices echoing between the trees, low chants in a cadence that was neither English nor any language he recognized. Following the sound, he came upon a clearing where fire pits glowed in a perfect circle. Around them stood figures in cloaks, and at the center lay what Marsh swore were bones, carefully arranged in patterns that seemed geometric, deliberate. His letter, later discovered among family papers, spoke of spiral formations traced with femurs, skulls placed at cardinal points, and stones carved with symbols unlike any known alphabet. He wrote that the air smelled of iron and ash, and that the chanting rose until it became almost unbearable. Marsh fled, leaving his instruments behind, and never returned to the barrens. He ended his account with a single line: they were not worshipping God. Nearly half a century later, in 1899, another witness surfaced. A game warden, Joseph Harker, testified in a private deposition taken after he resigned his post abruptly. While tracking poachers, he too came upon a circle of fire pits in the depths of the pines. But unlike Marsh, Harker described not only the bones, but the act itself. He claimed to have seen a figure brought into the clearing, bound and gagged, surrounded by chanting participants. The man was laid upon a stone slab carved with spirals and intersecting lines, then cut with ritual precision. Harker's notes say the blood was collected in shallow bowls, passed hand to hand, and poured upon the fire pits until the flames burned an unnatural green. His words, though written under oath, were suppressed by county officials who deemed them hallucinations brought on by fever. Harker fled the state soon after, his whereabouts thereafter unknown. Over the decades, archaeologists and curiosity seekers have uncovered remnants that seem to corroborate these accounts. Charred pits arranged in circles, stones marked with weathered spirals, and bones whose cuts match not butchery but ceremonial intent. Some of these finds rest quietly in university collections, mislabeled as colonial oddities. Others vanished into private hands, whispered about, but never displayed. What emerges from these fragments is a pattern: rituals held deep in the pines, far from the eyes of neighbors, where families gathered not for worship as we know it, but for something older, something that demanded blood. These ceremonies were not desperate acts of survival but carefully orchestrated rites, repeated generation after generation, leaving behind bones that still surface in the sandy soil to this day. The Pine Barrens may be vast and silent, but its soil remembers. The Atwater family first appears in the records of western Pennsylvania in the early 1800s, arriving from Connecticut with a wagon train of settlers bound for the coal fields. They established themselves in a narrow valley near the town of McKeesport, building a farmhouse, planting orchards, and attending the local church with outward respectability. At first glance, the Atwaters were no different from any frontier family. But in the pages of census documents and parish ledgers, a disturbing pattern emerges, one that scholars now call the vanishing bloodline. In 1820, the Atwater household numbered 15: parents, children, cousins, and hired hands. By 1840, the family count had inexplicably dropped to 9. A decade later, just 6. Records note no wars, no epidemics, no migrations to explain the decline. Neighbors muttered of midnight fires on the Atwater land, of smoke rising from the orchard where no harvest was taken. One account, preserved in a county diary, described cries carried on the wind, not of beasts but of kin. When the minister of the local parish questioned the family about absent children, he was met with silence and, eventually, a donation large enough to quiet further inquiry. By the late 19th century, the Atwaters had become almost spectral within the valley. Their farmhouse stood, but its windows were shuttered, its doors rarely opened. Locals claimed the family appeared in public only during the deepest winters, their faces pale, their bodies lean but strangely vigorous. And 1,879 census lists just 3 members: Elias Atwater, his sister Miriam, and a single boy of uncertain parentage. What became of the others is not recorded. What is certain is that no marriage records exist for the family after 1,865, suggesting that whatever children appeared were born not of lawful union but of something else, something unspoken. Folklore surrounding the Atwaters grew with every decade. Townsfolk whispered that they carried the hunger, a curse or compulsion that required them to consume their own bloodline to preserve their vigor. Farmers reported finding shallow graves in the woods behind the orchard, bones gnawed clean and arranged in deliberate patterns. The sheriff opened an investigation in 1892 after a farmhand went missing, but the case was closed when no evidence could be officially presented. Privately, his notebook still in the county archive contains a single damning line. "The bones were there, I saw them, and they were not of cattle." By 1920, only one Atwater remained, a woman named Clara listed as 50 years old, though neighbors swore she looked no more than 30. A year later, her name vanishes from all records. The farmhouse was abandoned, its fields overgrown, its windows broken by time. By 1930, no trace of the Atwaters remained in McKeesport or anywhere else in the state. The bloodline that had dwindled for a century was gone. Yet in the valley, older residents still tell of figures glimpsed between the trees on winter nights, gaunt and pale, watching the living with eyes that speak of a hunger never fully extinguished. In the Ozark Hills of northern Arkansas stands the collapsed shell of what was once the Little Zion Chapel, a clapboard church abandoned sometime before the First World War. Its rotting beams and vine-covered steeple would have passed into silence like so many forgotten rural sanctuaries, were it not for the discovery made in 1962 by a pair of local boys who crept inside to escape a summer storm. Beneath the pulpit, in a hollow cavity where the floorboards had been pried up, they found a stack of hymnals wrapped in oilcloth. The books, swollen with mildew but still intact, would later reveal a series of songs that bear little resemblance to the standard hymns sung in Arkansas congregations of the time. Their verses praised not salvation or Christ's sacrifice, but something far older and more unsettling. One hymn, written in a hand that mixed musical notation with crude script, begins with the refrain, "Bind us in blood-fed bonds, O Lord of the feast." Another, sung to the same rhythm as Rock of Ages, replaces the imagery of water and cleansing with invocations of flesh and marrow. A particularly chilling verse reads, "Not bread but bone, not wine but vein, we take and are made whole again." The congregants of Little Zion, it seems, had rewritten the very structure of their worship into a ritual celebration of cannibal practice. Scholars who examined the hymnals noted that many pages were heavily annotated. In the margins, biblical citations appeared alongside strange symbols, triangles, spirals, and crude depictions of chalices marked with drops. Some notes were legible instructions. "Keep fire low, circle thrice, bones to the north, blood to the south." Others were written in a cipher blending Latin abbreviations with what appeared to be phonetic spellings in German and an untraceable dialect. When translated, several passages aligned with rites described in European grimoires, yet here they were transplanted into the backwoods of Arkansas, concealed within the bindings of hymn books. Local memory confirmed fragments of the story. Elderly residents recalled that Little Zion's congregation had been unusually secretive. Families attended no other churches, accepted no visiting preachers, and barred outsiders from their services. When questioned, parishioners claimed they sang old songs passed down from ancestors. By 1910, the entire congregation had vanished. Census records show their surnames: Denslow, Kittredge, and Alt, disappearing within a decade, leaving only abandoned farms and the silent chapel. The hymnals were eventually locked away in a county archive, deemed too disturbing to display. Yet their existence lingers as evidence that worship in the Ozarks once twisted into something predatory, that hymns which should have lifted voices to heaven instead bound a congregation to rituals of flesh and secrecy. To this day, hunters in the hills sometimes report voices rising on the wind, hymns without melody, echoing from the ruins of Little Zion Chapel songs praising not redemption, but the bonds of blood. In 1892, St. Louis was a city swelling with industry and railroads, a hub where immigrants arrived daily and crime often slipped through the cracks of its crowded streets. Among the city's officials was Dr. Alistair Henderson, a respected coroner whose steady hand and meticulous records earned him the trust of the courts. His official reports, neat and clinical, catalogued the endless parade of accidents, murders, and illnesses that filled his docket. Yet hidden away in a locked drawer of his office was another book, a private ledger never meant to be seen by the public. It surfaced only decades later, discovered in the attic of a courthouse scheduled for demolition. The ledger tells a story very different from Henderson's official work. A story of bodies marked not by accident or wild animals, but by something he dared not name in public. The first entry is dated April 1892. Henderson describes the body of a woman found near the riverfront. Her torso bore ragged lacerations, the skin torn as if by teeth. In the official report filed to the sheriff, Henderson recorded the cause of death as mauling by stray dogs. Yet in his private ledger, his words are sharper. The wounds are unmistakably human. Incisors and canines, deep impressions. Flesh torn, not shredded, no doubt of the species. More entries follow through that year, each one stranger than the last. A child discovered in an alley, the bones of his arm cracked and sucked hollow. Two men brought in from the outskirts of the city, their throats ripped out and muscles stripped from their shoulders. Each time, Henderson filed the cause of death as wolf attack or wild animal predation, even though St. Louis, an urban center, had not seen wolves for decades. In his ledger, he wrestled with the impossibility of his observations. What creature mimics the dentition of man? What predator leaves the pattern of human jaws on human bone? Why conceal the truth? That question looms over every page. Some suggest Henderson feared ridicule, that no coroner could speak openly of human bite marks without implicating cannibalism, an accusation so monstrous it might have destroyed his career. Others believe he was warned. A note scrawled in the margin of one entry reads simply, "Told to close the file. Too much attention. These families are not to be named." The handwriting shakes, as if written under duress. By autumn of 1892, the attacks abruptly ceased. Henderson's ledger ends with a final, cryptic entry. It is organized, not desperation, but ritual. The evidence is there, but no one will allow it to be spoken. His official reports continued for years afterward, clean and orderly. But the private ledger remains a chilling record of a truth buried in plain sight: bite marks that were not from wolves, wounds that bore the unmistakable signature of human hunger. Black Hollow Mine was like many others in the hills of West Virginia during the late 19th century. A deep vein carved into the earth by men who carried lanterns on their caps and hunger in their bellies. It was hard work, but it fed families, and the town that grew around the mine depended on it. In 1895, while extending a new tunnel, miners broke through a wall of stone into a hollow space that had no place on their maps. What they found inside was not a natural cavern, but a chamber deliberately constructed, and within it, a site that still haunts the fragments of testimony that survived. The chamber was lined with skulls, hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows along the walls, each one resting in a niche carved by hand. Femurs and long bones formed patterns on the floor, some laid in circles, others in the shape of spirals. At the center stood a crude altar made of blackened rock, its surface pitted and scarred as if scorched by countless fires. One miner, writing years later in a letter never meant for publication, described the air inside as heavy and metallic, carrying the faint smell of ash and something far worse, something sweet and rotting at the same time. The men recoiled in horror, yet some ventured further, noting how clean the bones appeared. Not weathered, not gnawed by time, but polished, almost gleaming, as though whatever flesh had once covered them had been carefully stripped away. Too clean, several survivors repeated in their sworn statements to county officials. One even claimed to see knife marks etched into the bone, grooves too precise to be the work of decay. Word spread quickly through the mining town. Families whispered of old tales passed down in the mountains, of clans who had vanished generations earlier, consumed by rituals that demanded human flesh. Others believed the chamber had been used by some secret order, a brotherhood that gathered in the dark to feast away from the eyes of the world. Whatever the truth, the reaction of the authorities was swift and decisive. Within a week, the shaft leading to the chamber was sealed, declared structurally unstable and dangerous for further work. The official report cited concerns of collapse, but those who had stood in the chamber swore it had been solid as stone. The miners were ordered never to speak of what they had seen, yet the memory lingered in the town long after Black Hollow Mine closed. Some families moved away entirely, unwilling to raise children in a place where the earth itself seemed to harbor secrets. To this day, locals avoid the site, claiming that the ground above the old mine grows warm at night, as if fires still burn deep below. And on quiet evenings, when the wind threads through the hollows, some say it carries with it the faint echo of chanting, a chorus rising from the bones left undisturbed beneath Black Hollow. The most unsettling accounts in the history of America's hidden cannibal cults do not come from frightened neighbors, suspicious sheriffs, or curious doctors. They come from the children who were born into these families, raised under their roofs, and taught that what the world would call monstrous was simply tradition. Only a handful ever escaped, and fewer still dared to speak. Those who did often did so under assumed names, terrified that the families they fled would find them, or worse, that the hunger inside them would draw them back. In 1914, a man calling himself Robert Hale appeared at a mission house in Kansas City, gaunt and trembling. He told the chaplain that he had been raised in the hills of Tennessee in a clan that celebrated what they called the feast. Every winter solstice, children were gathered in a circle and made to drink from a chalice passed hand to hand. Hale swore that the liquid was blood, taken from one of the clan's elders. To refuse was unthinkable, he said, punishable by beatings or confinement in the root cellar until submission came. Hale wept as he described his initiation at the age of 9, when he first lifted the cup to his lips and felt it burn like fire in his chest. A woman known only as Margaret came forward in the 1930s during a WPA oral history project in Arkansas. Her account, buried in government archives for decades, describes being raised in what she called the circle of uncles. She claimed that while neighbors believed her family to be devout churchgoers, behind closed doors a different liturgy was practiced. Margaret said children were made to memorize hymns that praised not salvation, but appetite. She spoke of nights when she and other children were roused from bed and made to watch as relatives carved meat from bodies laid upon wooden tables. The children were not immediately forced to eat, she said, but were told, "One day it will be your duty, and your blessing." She escaped at 17, slipping away during a county fair. Her later years were spent moving from town to town, never marrying, convinced that her family still searched for her. The most chilling testimony surfaced in 1952, when a patient at a state hospital in Ohio, admitted under the name John A., confessed to doctors that he could not stop dreaming of blood. He told them he had been raised in a farmhouse where children were taught from infancy that the hunger is in us all. At 12, he said, he was made to place his lips to a wound opened deliberately in an elder's arm. drinking until he fainted. The doctors dismissed it as delusion, yet his knowledge of old regional family names matched those found in parish records of long-vanished clans. These testimonies are rare, but they share too many details to be coincidence. The drinking of blood as initiation. The hymns twisted into praises of flesh. The terror of escapees who never shook the feeling that they carried something inside them, a hunger inherited, passed down like a curse. Whether these survivors were mad, liars, or bearers of an unspeakable truth, their words linger like shadows. They suggest that the cults did not merely prey upon children. They raised them, shaped them, and prepared them to continue the feast for generations. The story of the vanishing orphans of Iowa begins quietly, hidden in the paperwork of county orphanages and adoption records from the first decade of the 20th century. Between 1904 and 1911, more than 30 children from institutions across the state were placed in the custody of one family living on the outskirts of Sioux City. At first, it was hailed as an act of charity. The Dunworths, a middle-aged farming couple with no surviving children of their own, appeared to offer hope to the forgotten wards of overcrowded orphanages. Neighbors praised them for their generosity, and newspapers ran small notices of each new adoption. Yet as the years passed, something unsettling became clear. Not a single one of those children was ever seen again outside the Dunworth farm. The farm itself stood isolated, set against a backdrop of windswept fields and a dense grove of trees that seemed to swallow sound. Locals described the Dunworths as polite but guarded. They seldom came to church, and when they did, they arrived alone, offering vague explanations for why the children remained at home. Visitors reported strange silences around the house, and those who delivered supplies spoke of shadows moving in the windows, though no voices or laughter could be heard. By 1910, whispers circulated in Sioux City that something was wrong. County officials questioned the family about the children's whereabouts, but the records always showed them still in residence. The Dunworths claimed the children were homeschooled, too frail for public outings, or engaged in farm chores. With no evidence of wrongdoing, authorities moved on, though some social workers admitted privately that the visits left them deeply uneasy. The truth, or what little can be reconstructed of it, surfaced only after tragedy. In the spring of 1913, the Dunworth farmhouse was consumed by fire. Neighbors rushed to the scene but could do nothing as the structure collapsed into flames. When the ashes cooled, investigators found no trace of human remains, neither of the couple nor of the dozens of children supposedly living there. What they did uncover was a stone cellar beneath the house. Its walls were blackened by fire, but among the rubble lay bones. Some were clearly animal, but others bore the unmistakable shape of human remains, small enough to belong to children. Several long bones were fractured and hollowed, as though their marrow had been extracted. The county sheriff filed a cautious report, citing the bones as inconclusive and the cause of the fire as accidental. Yet locals were unconvinced. Some swore they had seen the Dunworths fleeing into the woods before the flames rose. Others whispered that the fire had not been accident at all, but cleansing an attempt to erase evidence of rituals carried out in secret beneath the farmhouse. The Dunworth name vanished from Sioux City records after 1913, and no surviving kin ever came forward to claim the land. The site remains an empty field, yet farmers in the area still claim that on windless nights they hear faint cries drifting across the grass, as if the voices of those children never truly left. The winter of 1887 remains etched in Montana's history as one of the cruelest on record. Blizzards swept across the plains and mountains, burying settlements in snowdrifts higher than rooftops. Cattle froze where they stood, their stiff bodies scattered like statues across the open range. Families huddled inside cabins with dwindling supplies, many perishing before spring. Newspapers from Helena to Billings carried grim tallies of the dead. Yet among these stories of hardship and hunger lies an account that was quietly suppressed, whispered only in back rooms, and remembered in fragments. the tale of a family that not only survived the Red Winter but seemed to thrive. The Whitlock family lived in a remote homestead north of Miles City. When neighbors finally reached them in March, they found the Whitlocks healthy, ruddy-cheeked, and strangely well-fed. Unlike other households that had turned to roots, leather, or starvation, the Whitlock cellar was stocked with barrels of salted meat, each one neatly sealed and stacked in rows. Visitors recalled the rich smell of cooking that filled the house and the Whitlocks' insistence that they had hunted game before the storms set in. Skepticism grew when no tracks or skins were found, and when it became clear that game had been scarce in the region even before the first snows fell. Questions intensified after the thaw. Suspicious officials, prompted by whispers in the settlement, ordered an inspection of the Whitlock farm. The barrels of meat were removed and sent to a nearby fort for examination. Though no official document survives in county archives, a private letter written by one of the examining officers described the moment the barrels were opened. The cuts, he said, were too uniform, too refined, and undeniably human. Bones discovered buried near the homestead carried the marks of knives, their marrow hollowed. The officer concluded grimly, "This was no accident of starvation, but a deliberate harvest." The community reeled. Several missing persons had been reported that winter travelers stranded on the road, a peddler who never arrived at his next stop, even a pair of ranch hands who vanished after seeking shelter near the Whitlock property. Their fates, it seemed, had been preserved in brine, yet the scandal never reached the newspapers. The Whitlocks were not tried. The family left Montana quietly within weeks of the discovery, their destination unknown. The official report filed with the county listed the contents of the barrels only as spoiled provisions. Locals kept the memory alive in whispers. Old settlers warned their children never to trust strangers offering food in the dead of winter. Some claimed the Whitlocks carried their practices with them, leaving behind a trail of disappearances in towns where their name briefly surfaced before vanishing again. In Montana, the Red Winter of 1887 is remembered for its storms, but in the shadow of that blizzard lies a darker survival tale, one family who feasted while others starved, and the unholy secret sealed in their barrels. Across America's scattered landscapes where whispers of cannibal cults still cling to memory, investigators and folklorists have documented a recurring language carved not on paper, but into the very wood and stone of forgotten places. In abandoned farmhouses, in the beams of collapsing barns, even on the pews of ruined churches, marks appear with unnerving consistency. These are not idle graffiti or the careless work of children. They are symbols, repeated across decades and regions, carved with ritual care. They form what some now call the silent scripture of hunger. The most common of these is the spiral, etched deep into door frames or fence posts, often layered upon itself as if drawn again and again. Archaeologists note that spirals appear in many ancient cultures, representing cycles or eternity, but in these contexts the meaning darkens. Survivors' testimonies describe the spiral as a reminder of the feast's eternal return, each turn representing a year, each curve a promise that what had been consumed would be renewed. In one ruined cabin in western Pennsylvania, researchers found 3 spirals carved into the hearthstone, each one filled with ashes and fragments of bone. Another recurring figure is the interlocking triangle, 2 or 3 shapes woven together so their points touch. The form resembles occult sigils, yet appears most often in utilitarian spaces, carved into the beams of barns, hidden under the lids of barrels, scratched into cellar doors. A letter from a sheriff in Iowa in 1912 describes finding the symbol on every doorway of the Dunworth farm, where the vanishing orphans were last seen. According to his private notes, the symbol was believed to guard the house, not from evil entering, but from the feast escaping. Most disturbing of all is the glyph known among folklorists as the empty mouth. At first glance, it is a crude oval, a circle carved raggedly with nothing inside. Yet in every site where it appears, it is always placed at eye level, staring outward like a warning or an invitation. Witnesses who grew up in suspected families claimed it represented the hunger itself, an open mouth waiting to be filled. In the hymnals recovered from the Ozarks, the glyph is drawn beside verses praising the vessel of flesh. In the Black Hollow mine chamber, one skull bore the mark burned directly into its forehead. These signs and symbols are scattered across states, separated by time and distance, yet their recurrence is undeniable. They speak to a network, or at the very least a shared tradition, passed in secrecy from one bloodline to another. No written doctrine has ever been found, no manual of rituals unearthed, yet these carvings serve the same purpose. They are the words left behind by people who believed hunger could be sanctified, who inscribed their devotion into wood and stone so it could outlast their flesh. Even now, hikers in remote parts of Appalachia sometimes stumble upon them, spirals in the bark of old pines or triangles cut into beams of collapsing barns. The marks persist, and with them the question, if the symbols remain, do the cults that carved them also endure? The confessions that survive are scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror, brief glimpses into lives already unraveling. They come not from outsiders or investigators, but from those who claim to have been within the cults themselves. Men and women brought before courts on charges that rarely matched the horrors their words implied. Most transcripts from these trials are perfunctory, sanitized for the record. Yet hidden among them, in margins or suppressed depositions, 3 testimonies remain intact. They are the closest we have to hearing the cults speak in their own voices. The first is from 1869, preserved in a county archive in Missouri. A woman named Abigail Cross, accused of child neglect, whispered her confession not to the jury, but to the stenographer who recorded her words anyway. "The hunger was not ours," she said, her voice breaking. "It was theirs. We only obeyed." When pressed on who they were, Abigail closed her eyes and muttered, "The ones who came at night, standing in the corners of the room, tall, with mouths that never closed. We ate so they would leave." She was found guilty of neglect, sentenced to a year in prison, and died before completing her term. No further questions were asked about the figures she described. The second testimony appears in the files of an 1895 trial in Kentucky. A man named Thomas Bell, charged with grave robbing after human remains were discovered near his property, attempted to explain his actions. "It was not for me," he insisted, his words scratched shakily in the transcript. "It was for them. They wanted it fresh, and if I refused, they came into the house, whispering my children's names." The court dismissed his claims as madness. Bell was declared insane and committed to an asylum, where he died within a year. His family vanished from census records soon after. The third confession is perhaps the most chilling, recorded in 1922 during a closed hearing in Ohio. A teenager named Samuel Price, charged with arson after setting fire to a barn, told authorities he had done it to stop the gatherings inside. "We sang the hymns they taught us," he explained, "but I could see them behind the walls, moving in the shadows. We ate because the elders told us it kept them fed, but it was never enough. It was never for us, it was for them." Samuel's case was sealed. He disappeared into the state system, never mentioned again. These 3 voices, separated by decades and miles, echo the same terrible refrain, that the hunger belonged not to the people themselves, but to something else, something unseen that demanded obedience. Whether these were delusions, metaphors, or glimpses of entities like those hinted at in other chapters is impossible to prove, yet the consistency is unnerving. Again and again the accused spoke not of choice but of compulsion, of forces they described as "they," who fed through human hands and mouths. If the testimonies are to be believed, the feasts were never merely acts of human depravity. They were offerings, paid in flesh, to something that watched from the shadows and waited for its due. Among the fragments of record and rumor that trace America's hidden cults, one theme returns with unsettling regularity: Inheritance. Unlike crimes born of desperation or violence born in sudden madness, these rights endured precisely because they were passed from parent to child like a family heirloom. The inheritance of flesh was deliberate, structured, and cruel, ensuring the ritual survived across generations. In parish registers from rural Pennsylvania, researchers found a peculiar pattern. Youngest sons in certain families never married outside their bloodline, though older brothers often did. Local gossip claimed these boys were promised, though promised to what remained unspoken. Letters from one minister in 1873 mention that the youngest Atwater child was kept from the schoolhouse, instructed only at home, and seen only during winter months. The implication, whispered in his correspondence, was that the boy had been set aside for something that required secrecy and isolation, prepared to inherit a role he could neither choose nor escape. Daughters, too, bore the weight of inheritance. In Iowa and Arkansas records, marriage licenses reveal unions so tightly bound between a handful of surnames that outsiders remarked it looked like a net pulled tight. Cousins married cousins, and young women barely of age were wed to men decades older. One such case, noted in a suppressed 1911 court document, described a 16-year-old girl who attempted to flee her family before being forced to wed her uncle. Her testimony, though stricken from the official record, survives in the clerk's private notes. They said if I refused, the hunger would turn on us all. They said my body was the bond. These forced marriages and chosen heirs ensured that the cult's practices remained hidden. Outsiders were rarely permitted to enter, and when they did, they often vanished without explanation. Children born within were raised to see the rituals not as horror but as tradition, a duty as binding as farm chores or church attendance. To them, blood was not only a metaphor for kinship, but the literal substance that tied them to the hunger they served. What makes this inheritance particularly chilling is the consistency across states and decades. From the Pine Barrens of New Jersey to the Ozarks of Arkansas, the same roles recur: the youngest son, the sacrificed daughter, the marriage that keeps bloodlines closed. Even in the 20th century, when census data begins to thin and family names disappear, fragments of oral history confirm that the pattern continued. The secrecy was effective because it was rooted in family itself. Outsiders might suspect strange behavior, but who could prove what happened within locked houses, among kin bound not just by name but by ritual? Inheritance became the cult's strongest weapon. Every generation carried the hunger forward, not as a curse to be broken but as a duty to be fulfilled. In this way, the inheritance of flesh did not merely sustain families, it erased them, consuming their line until nothing remained but rumors, symbols carved into beams, and the faint memory of names that once carried terrible weight. In the chaos of the 1940s, when the United States was consumed by war abroad and espionage at home, another investigation flickered briefly in the shadows before being swallowed whole. Buried among the millions of pages declassified decades later are fragments of FBI memoranda and field reports referencing a subject almost unthinkable: ritualistic anthropophagy. The phrase appears sparingly, tucked into case files on missing persons and strange gatherings in remote rural areas. Yet even these fragments are riddled with heavy black strokes of redaction, entire paragraphs excised as though the very words themselves were dangerous to preserve. One memo dated March 1943 from the street Louis Field Office describes organized gatherings under cover of rural congregations where agents suspected cannibalistic rites linked to long-standing bloodline traditions. The names of towns and families are blotted out, replaced with black bars. What survives is a chilling sentence left untouched. The hunger is described as external, but exercised through the family as host. The language echoes testimonies taken decades earlier in county courts, suggesting the Bureau had stumbled onto something older than the war itself. Other documents reference operations in Appalachia, where investigators tracked disappearances of draft-age men never reported missing by their families. In one report from 1944, a field agent recorded entering an abandoned church in Kentucky and finding the pews carved with spirals and interlocking triangles, the same symbols later catalogued by folklorists. His description ends mid-sentence, the rest blacked out. A marginal note from a reviewing supervisor reads simply, "Not to be circulated outside Bureau." Why were these cases buried? Some historians argue the government feared panic during wartime, unwilling to admit that ritual cannibalism was not a relic of distant lands, but a hidden stain within American soil. Others suggest a more disturbing possibility, that elements within the Bureau recognized the cult's networks of secrecy and chose not to interfere, allowing them to fade deeper underground rather than risk exposure. One particularly disturbing document, dated November 1946, references Project Agrippa, a name whose purpose remains unknown. Only a few sentences are legible. They describe anthropophagic groups embedded in rural communities, passed by inheritance, and the urgent need for containment through silence. The rest is gone beneath thick, black ink. The files released to the public decades later are less a record of investigation than a record of erasure. They show glimpses of agents stepping into the same shadows that county sheriffs and local doctors had brushed against for more than a century. Yet rather than shine light, the Bureau closed the box, sealing knowledge away under the weight of federal authority. What remains is a haunting question. If the FBI knew and chose silence, how much of the hunger still lingers, unseen, in the corners of America? Throughout the 20th century, scattered academics attempted to piece together the fragments of folklore, court records, and suppressed testimonies surrounding America's darkest cult practices. Each time, the effort ended not with revelation, but with silence, sometimes enforced by circumstance, sometimes by death. The record of these vanished voices forms a shadow archive, a history of anthropologists silenced before their work could ever reach the public. In 1928, Professor Harold Green of the University of Chicago prepared a paper for the American Anthropological Association titled Ritual Consumption in Isolated Rural Communities. He had spent years collecting oral histories in the Ozarks and Appalachian Hollows, stories that spoke of feasts where bread was replaced by bone. Weeks before the conference, Green died in what newspapers called a freak accident, struck by a falling beam while visiting a barn in rural Kentucky. His notes disappeared from his office, and the only surviving mention of his research comes from a colleague who later remarked that Green's obsession with cannibalistic folklore had been unwise. 2 decades later, in 1951, Margaret Lowe, a graduate student at Columbia, undertook fieldwork in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. She wrote letters to her advisor describing symbols carved into church pews and barns. Marks, she believed, indicated ritual anthropophagy persisting as inherited practice. Lowe never returned from her final trip. Her body was found in a ravine, her notebooks missing. Police declared it an accident, attributing her fall to unstable terrain. Within months, her advisor's attempts to publish her earlier findings were blocked. The official explanation: her notes had been classified under matters of national security. The pattern continued into the 1970s. Dr. Alan Pierce, a folklorist at the University of Iowa, announced plans to release a book synthesizing decades of rumors: the Atwater bloodline, the vanishing orphans, the Black Hollow mine. Before the manuscript could be printed, Pierce died in a house fire that investigators later declared suspicious but unresolved. When colleagues attempted to retrieve his research from his office, they found the cabinets emptied, his drafts gone. One librarian, speaking anonymously years later, recalled that government men had visited the archives days before, removing boxes labeled with Pierce's name. What links these cases is not just tragedy but suppression. Over and over, the scholars who tried to bring this hidden history into light met sudden ends, while their work was confiscated or buried under vague claims of national security. It is as though the hunger itself was guarded not only by bloodlines, but by institutions unwilling to let the public glimpse what lies beneath the surface of American history. If knowledge of these cults was dangerous enough to kill for, then perhaps the silence surrounding them was not mere neglect. It was deliberate, a warning carved not in wood or bone, but in the lives of those who dared to study the feast too closely. Even in the present day, long after the names of the old families faded from census rolls and their homesteads rotted into the earth, reports continue to surface that bear the same terrible signature. They arrive piecemeal: a newspaper clipping from a rural county, a missing persons bulletin quietly withdrawn, a half-burned church discovered in the woods. Taken individually, they are tragedies. Viewed together, they echo the same pattern that has haunted America for centuries. In 1994, a volunteer fire crew in eastern Kentucky responded to a blaze in an abandoned chapel deep in the Appalachian foothills. The roof had already collapsed, but what chilled the men was not the fire, it was what remained beneath the ashes. Bones, dozens of them, some charred, some arranged in circles on the stone floor. Local authorities attributed them to animal remains left by squatters, though photographs taken before the site was bulldozed clearly show human skulls. The official report, signed by the county sheriff, lists the cause of fire as unknown electrical fault. No wiring had ever been installed in the chapel. In Alaska, where isolation offers perfect cover, hunters occasionally stumble upon scenes that should not exist. One case in 2003 involved a pair of snowmobilers near Bethel who found a cabin smoldering in the tundra. Inside, the charred remains of 5 individuals were discovered. The autopsy revealed knife scoring along the bones, yet the coroner dismissed it publicly as damage from collapse. Privately, one EMT confided that the marrow had been hollowed out, something he had only seen in anthropological case studies of ritual cannibalism. The families of the dead received little explanation, and the case vanished from state records within a year. The Midwest has its own shadows. In 2011, a farming family of 6 disappeared from their homestead in Nebraska. Neighbors recalled strange gatherings in the barn weeks before, lights flickering after midnight, chanting carried across the fields. When police finally entered the property, the barn had burned to its foundations. Among the wreckage, investigators found bones too large in number to belong solely to the missing family. A sealed report in the county archive, later leaked, notes that remains of at least 10 individuals were present. No suspects were ever named, and the property was sold quietly the following year. These cases are dismissed as coincidence, as rural rumor, as misinterpretation of evidence. Yet to those who have traced the history of America's darkest cults, the echoes are too familiar. Burned churches, vanished families, bones left in ritual patterns. The hunger did not vanish with the Atwaters or the Dunworths. It adapted, resurfacing in isolated pockets where secrecy still thrives. In modern America, the feast continues, but now it wears the mask of silence, hidden not by ignorance, but by willful erasure. Among the most disturbing accounts collected in the margins of this history are those of descendants who tried to leave it behind. They bore the names of families whispered in county records, surnames that had once drawn suspicion, though generations later the rituals themselves seemed forgotten. Yet those who carried the blood often spoke of shadows that would not let them go. They called it the curse of the bloodline, a hunger that did not die even when the family scattered. In 1938, a young man named Edward Morris left West Virginia to work in a Pittsburgh steel mill. He married, raised 2 children, and never returned to the hollow where his family had lived for generations. But letters to his sister, preserved by her descendants, describe nights where he woke screaming, convinced that faces stood at the foot of the bed, mouths open wider than they should. His health declined rapidly despite his youth. Doctors diagnosed anemia, though no treatment restored his strength. He died at 34, gaunt and trembling, whispering to his wife that he could still hear the chanting under the floorboards. A case from Arkansas in the 1960s tells of Margaret Kittredge, whose family had once worshipped at the infamous Little Zion Chapel. She attempted to sever ties, legally changing her name and moving to California. Yet, in interviews conducted years later, she confessed that sleep never brought rest. She dreamed of hymns she had not heard since childhood, voices calling her back to a church that no longer stood. When she gave birth to a son, she claimed the boy began humming the same tuneless chants before he could speak. At 27, Margaret collapsed suddenly during a church service. The coroner recorded heart failure. Her son disappeared from records soon after, as if swallowed into the very silence she had tried to escape. More recently, in 1999, a man identified only as SP sought counseling in Ohio, insisting that his family carried what he called the appetite. His grandfather had fled Kentucky decades earlier, yet SP claimed every male in his family line died before 40. He reported unrelenting nightmares of cellars, feasts, and spirals carved into walls. 2 months into therapy, he was found dead in his apartment. The cause was listed as an accidental fall, though the attending paramedics noted symbols scratched into the wood of his doorframe, circles and triangles, eerily similar to those documented in cult sites a century earlier. These stories persist, whispered by descendants who feel stalked by something invisible, as if their blood itself were claimed. Whether the hunger is psychological trauma passed through generations or something far older clinging to a family's name, the result is the same. To inherit such a lineage is to live with the knowledge that escape may be impossible. The hunger, once invited, does not forget. It waits, patient and insatiable, until the blood remembers. The stories you have heard are fragments, scattered like bones in shallow graves across the landscape of America. They surface in court ledgers, in yellowed newspapers, in letters never meant for public eyes. Each on its own might be dismissed as rumor, as madness, as the fevered invention of frightened minds. Yet taken together, they form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. It is a history America has tried to bury, not beneath stone or soil, but beneath silence. Officials sealed the files, academics were silenced, families changed their names and disappeared into the anonymity of time. And still, the whispers remain. What makes these accounts so disturbing is not simply what they reveal of the past, but what they suggest about the present. Rituals of hunger that thrived in barns, churches, and family homesteads may no longer be spoken aloud, yet signs of their persistence linger like echoes in forgotten valleys. Bones discovered in burned-out buildings, symbols carved where no one should be, descendants who cannot outrun the nightmares that stalk their blood. The feast may have been broken in places, but the hunger that drove it never truly dies. It waits, patient, in the shadows between generations. There is a reason records vanish. There is a reason reports are redacted and files stamped with words like national security. To know too much is to draw the attention of something older than the Republic itself. Something that feeds not just on flesh, but on secrecy, on obedience, on fear. Those who sought to bring the truth to light, scholars, doctors, investigators, often paid with their lives. Their notes ended in fire, their voices cut off before they reached an audience. That pattern, too, is part of the inheritance. The price of knowing is always high. And so the warning must be spoken clearly. Do not go looking for what history has tried to erase. Do not follow the spirals carved into old beams or trace the triangles etched into pews. Do not open hymnals that praise blood or journals that speak of the hunger. If you find a book bound in leather that seems to drink the light, leave it where it lies. Curiosity may be human, but hunger is eternal, and once seen, it does not easily let go. America buries its darkest truths beneath layers of silence, but silence is not the same as absence. Some bargains, once made, echo forever. Some appetites never end. The rituals may be forgotten, But the hunger still stirs and it remembers those who dare to look too closely.